has over 20 years of experience in coastal wetland ecology and restoration. Since 1996, her research has focused on evaluating the interaction of environmental factors and plant communities in seagrass meadows, tidal marshes, and forested wetlands using field studies and spatial analysis. She applies the findings of her research to better understand complex ecosystem processes, improve restoration success, and predict potential climate change effects. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Another long-winded introduction, sorry. Okay, I only have one screen today, and I haven't ever shared a presentation with one screen, so bear with me for just a second. Okay. Is that working? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it's not full screen yet, though. We're seeing, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to turn my video off just because of limited bandwidth, just to hopefully make it go a little bit better. Okay, those were two really great presentations preceding me and gave a very good introduction to some of the things underlying the things that I'm going to talk about. So I really appreciated some of that detail. I don't have quite as much really beautiful imagery, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the data processing and analysis that we've done, really trying to develop some methods for automated mapping and understanding ecosystem change at both restoration and reference sites. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work. At PNNL, we have a great team of data scientists, spatial analysts, people much smarter than me on these things that have done a lot of really great work. Andre Coleman is leading that effort. And then we've been working with Curtis Regner at NOAA Fisheries. A lot of this work was funded through NOAA program grants. And Curtis's vision of how this work can really be used has been great, keeping us all focused on the end game. And then we also have been working with RICA UAS. They are the pilots and the drone operators, putting together these different unmanned aerial systems that we've used for this work. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. All right. So just by way of overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've done with hyperspectral imagery and LiDAR. Going through the various different parts of that. Talk a little bit about work with RGB 3-band orthomosaic imagery, some other applications, and then a little bit about lessons learned and where we're headed next. Okay, so first off, a little bit about our field effort. We were focused most recently, this was work done in 2020, excuse me, at 3 sites in the Columbia River. We looked at Miller Sands, which is dredge material placement site, Carlson Island as a reference wetland site, and Steamboat Slough restoration site. And the drone system is a DJI Matrice 600. We were using a base spec push broom hyperspectral imager, and we also had a Phoenix LiDAR mini ranger system with an integrated 42 megapixel RGB camera. So as the others mentioned, the importance, if you're going to create an orthomosaic or do anything, any kind of mosaic with your imagery, you have to collect ground and control points. So we use something new in 2020 we hadn't used before, the picture on the left there is called a arrow point. It's a self-contained unit that you put on the ground, and it sends up a GPS signal and collects data for as long as you have it out there, but hopefully at least a minimum of 3 or 4 hours. And so then it basically is a geo-referenced point in and of itself. It's also clearly very visible in any imagery that's collected. So we had about a dozen of those that we put out. We also put out sort of the old-fashioned kind of ground control points, the white V that you see on the right, scattered throughout the site. And we then measured or collected RTK points on all of those. One, to kind of see how good the arrow points were at collecting, spatial location, but also because we wanted the accuracy of the elevation and horizontal positioning. Then we also collected a whole bunch of ground truth points. So with the RTK, we collected hundreds of elevation points to be able to ground truth and evaluate the LiDAR. We collected plant community information. We identified plant ID at many hundreds of points, and then also took measurements of plant height, because another thing we were hoping to use the LiDAR for was a means of estimating plant height from first and last return data of the LiDAR, and using that to estimate productivity. So we also collected biomass samples at a couple of those sites to develop a model of plant height and biomass. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the processing because it's very involved, but just to go over briefly some of the steps involved. So the hyperspectral imagery is very, very data intensive. It's 115 bands of data. And so the data is collected in these little image chips. And there's over 1,000 of these at each site. And they are not georeferenced. The hope, we actually added a GPS unit to our UAS this last in 2020 that was put out by BaySpec, the hyperspectral image camera maker, in order to create an automatic georeferencing system. But the system just did not work as it was supposed to, and we encountered a lot of problems with that. We spent a lot of time trying to troubleshoot with the company, and in the end, we ended up having to manually georeference them, which includes a process of creating these image strips and then georeferencing the image strips based on the underlying true color orthomosaic that was created from the LiDAR RGB imagery. So the next step is basically reducing the noise in the hyperspectral data. So with all of those many bands covering a wide range of different reflectance values, we used a method called minimal noise fraction that basically spectrally and spatially separates out the noise. So the lower bands contain more of the spatial structure and the most important information, and the higher bands contain most of the noise. So we eliminated the spectral bands that don't contribute to the classification because of noise, making it much cleaner to deal with the classification. We used all those ground truth points I mentioned as part of the processing. So we had 298 ground truth points that had plant identification data associated with them. I'm talking about Steamboat Slough here as an example. So from that, we created 239 training polygons within the imagery, and then used Python script called scikit-learn to, it's basically a machine learning tool to develop the training for the classification. So the polygons were, the training and testing was about an 80 to 20% split. We have done some work with spectral library development, because that's really the big advantage of using hyperspectral, is that each plant has a unique spectral signature. And so this figure shows an example of some of the kinds of vegetation that we encounter and what the spectral signature from the imager on the drone picks up, what it's actually measuring. And you can see there's a wide range, there's a lot of variation. And we also, this last year, then started to collect some data from the ground. So we have a handheld spectroradiometer that we were using to collect data from specific species on the ground, to try to really hone in on what the difference is in these different spectral signatures, and to be able to tie that in ultimately with the classification. This is still a work in progress, but as more data is collected, this will definitely improve the classification methods. So we did run then image classification using support vector machine was the classification method. We had 26 classes, vegetation and other categories of classes. So we had logs, bare ground, open water. But the majority of the classes were vegetation classes. These are the vegetation codes. So we were able to distinguish species like reed canary grass, carex, common rush, typha, cattails. So really pretty good distinction between all of those different classes. Our accuracy was 81%, which we were pretty happy with. So then I'm going to turn just a little bit briefly to a project that we did at in Willapa Bay using the same UAS system, but for a slightly different purpose. We were looking at intertidal habitats, and one of the primary goals was to determine whether we could map burrowing shrimp habitat. If you know that, the burrowing shrimp create little microtopography in their burrowing. They create mounds. So we worked with this set of tools to develop a method to map that, which worked really great. We were not able to use our hyperspectral camera, however. There were problems with that data collection. And so as part of the habitat classification, we were also classifying mostly eelgrass, Japanese and native eelgrass at the site, but also oysters and some algae, macroalgae that was out there. And so since we couldn't use the hyperspectral, we decided to see what we could determine and gain from using just the RGB imagery. So we used a random forest method for the classification. All the other processing, though, was really very similar to what we had used for the hyperspectral, using the Python machine learning methods and all of that. And we got 83% accuracy for the classifications using just the RGB. And also some of that, we did use the LiDAR intensity also for that. So we were thrilled with this finding. It's what's the saying? necessity is the mother of invention, something like that. So this was something we hadn't really planned to do specifically, but it was something that resulted and gave us new hope for potentially looking at the RGB imagery. So we went back to our data at Steamboat and decided to use those same methods on the RGB imagery. We didn't use the LiDAR data because we wanted to just see how it would perform with just using the RGB imagery, and it worked great. We got a 78% accuracy, slightly lower than what we got with hyperspectral, but definitely a lot of benefits from using just this kind of imagery, including the fact that it's easier to collect and being collected by a wide variety of people very easily. So just to do a bit of a comparison between the two methods, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but I went through the difference, obviously, in the bands between 115 versus 3 bands. The spatial resolution was actually lower, higher pixel value with a hyperspectral, so 25 centimeter resolution versus 1.3 with the RGB. I've highlighted the things that I think are really notable in what these differences are. So the yellow means the hyperspectral isn't as, or that the whichever it is, the yellow is not as good, the green is better. So with georeferencing, obviously, we had all those issues with the hyperspectral. So it was a manual process. It was very time consuming, and the RGB is automated. It's a very seamless process, happens very quickly. The processing, there was the noise and some missing data, gaps in the data from various processing issues. With the hyperspectral, we had continuous data with the RGB. The other processing was pretty intensive for both of them. We used the noise reduction that I talked about with the hyperspectral, but with the RGB, we also did several derivations of the data. So looking at the mean of the blue band and the standard deviation within those training polygons. We also did a GLI, which is a green leaf index, which is derived from the 3 bands. And then the processing time is another downside with the hyperspectral. Many days went into the processing for the hyperspectral because of the data intensity and a lot of computing power. The RGB was more on the order of hours. The different classifications I talked about, the training time was somewhat similar. It was a little bit less time for the hyperspectral. The prediction time, so this is when the classifier is working to predict the outcome of the classification. It was quicker for the hyperspectral because of the difference in resolution. It took about 10 hours of some pretty heavy computing power to develop that classification for the RGB imagery. The accuracy was fairly similar, and this is another really big difference that we don't know for sure the answer to this yet, but the automation potential is very high with hyperspectral because of that spectral signature that we get from that multiple bands of data. So there's still much higher potential for being able to automate that and use it with little ground collection data for use in sites across the estuary. With the RGB, we don't know yet what that will look like. It's more likely that ground truth data may need to be collected at each site to be able to run that model and get good classification accuracy. So this is an example of some data collected by Columbia Land Trust, Austin Tomlinson there. This is Carey Island, where we're doing some work on doing reed canary grass control. We've set up an experiment there with several different treatments and control plots. And you can see in this imagery that the kind of bluish, this orange represents an area where we did not apply any treatment, the treatments being spraying and seeding, and it's nearly all reed canary grass. So you can see that bluish, and the green, the bright green, is native vegetation. That some of it is coming in on its own, a lot in these lower lying areas, but also in the high treatment plots. You can see the blue squares here represent higher elevation treatment plots, and very effective. So this would be a great application to be able to apply this RGB classification method to use some of the data that we're collecting at the site to see if it, you know, if we can get the same level of accuracy here. And I will say that the RGB classification was finished this morning, which is why we haven't done any more work with it, but we're anxious to see if we can apply it to some of these other areas. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to data we collected with the LiDAR. So this is an example of the point cloud collected at Miller Sands, which is the dredge material placement island. Dredge material was placed back in the 70s to actively create this island, and then it's continually, it's still an active dredge material placement site. And the image on the right is the digital surface model that was derived from the point cloud. You can see all these funny hummocks there, and you can see them in the point cloud data too. So this was a very recent dredge material placement that had occurred at that site. And so these hummocks are on the order of, well, I don't know, maybe 5 meters high or more. You lose yourself when you walk down in amongst them. So they were a very unique feature, but really cool feature to capture on in the imagery. So one of the things we did was a comparison between the LiDAR data that was collected back in 2010. So this is the aerial airborne LiDAR sensor that was used for the entire estuary. And we just wanted to look at doing a comparison between 2010 and 2020. So we used our, this is the just the ground surface elevation. So removing all of that first return data, all of the trees and vegetation removed. So looking just at the ground surface comparison. And we estimated the volume from in this area of volume above a 1.7 meter baseline between the 2 years. And then we did a change analysis and compared to see what the volume change was. And so this is, you know, of interest for dredge material placement to know the volume that has actually been retained at the site. There's a lot of erosion and deposition that happens. And so understanding that dynamic is important. So we calculated a net volume increase at that site, 42,000 cubic meters. Okay, so one of the other things that we're really interested in using the LiDAR for was for estimating plant height and using that then to develop a biomass productivity model. So these plots represent, this is again from Steamboat Slough. So this represents a comparison between the LiDAR data and the on the ground RTK data and plant height measurement data that we collected. So the one on the left is showing the comparison between the RTK ground height measurement, so ground elevation, and the LiDAR ground elevation. And so basically it's showing that the LiDAR overestimates in general, the ground elevation, but it differs by species. So that's important. I mean, we know that from LiDAR data. There's been lots of studies looking at LiDAR data for this purpose and trying to, see how accurate it is at estimating the ground elevation. And so where the vegetation is very dense, especially with like reed canary grass can form sort of mats, the LiDAR is less able to penetrate through to the ground. So overall, the median was 16 centimeters difference between the RTK and the LiDAR. So really not too bad, but if we really want to estimate plant height, we want to be able to correct for that. So we are developing correction factors based on the different plant species, and we'll apply that using the classified imagery to correct the LiDAR data. Similarly, we compared to the plant heights, and we were able to see what that difference is, and it's the opposite there. The plant height is generally underestimated by the LiDAR, and that also makes sense because as the LiDAR is penetrating, it may miss the top of the plants, especially if they're tall, skinny plants like cattails or bulrush. And depends on the density of the vegetation and how much they lean over and the variability and all kinds of things. And so we, again, were able to quantify, in general, there was about a 26 centimeter difference between what we measured in the field and what the LiDAR was measuring. So again, we'll apply these correction factors. And then from our biomass samples that we collected, we're able to develop a regression model looking at we categorize the plants into these different elevation categories. So these wetlands vary a lot in the plant species that grow at low elevations, mid elevations, and high elevations, with generally bigger, more dense, more robust plants growing in the higher elevations. And you can see that with the low elevations here, showing very much lower biomass, but they do increase with height along this regression line. Similarly, mid elevation, lower biomass in general, but getting into some of those larger species. And then the blue represents the high marsh, and that's the problem area where there's many species that kind of fit in this kind of clump in the middle here, where they're approximately the same height and roughly the same biomass, and not a whole lot of differentiation between them. So we're still working on teasing that out. We collected almost 50 samples, but it wasn't really quite enough to be able to tease out some of those differences. So we're looking at other data sources, like from the ecosystem monitoring program, samples that have been collected in the past that have both plant height and biomass data associated with them. So hoping to improve that model and then apply it site-wide is the plan by at least elevation category of species, if not particular species. So our next steps are to refine the hyperspectral methods. We are looking at potentially using a different camera. The base spec we've had that camera about 5 years, and there are definitely some new and improved models out there. We need to resolve this GPS problem so that can go away. But really think it still holds great potential for automating the mapping process with less ground collection. And then we're working on refining that LiDAR biomass model. And we would also like to do some additional RGB classification using the methods we've developed to see how applicable this method is in different kinds of conditions, and whether how much ground truth data really needs to be collected for that effort. So thank you very much for listening, and that's all I have.
Thank you, Amy. Very interesting. Are there any questions from the ERTG for Amy? Kirk, I think.
This is Kirk. I have one quick question. First, thanks. That was really interesting. What statistic or how did you classify accuracy, the error rates? They were all around 80.
Yeah, well, we used a proportion of the training samples. A portion of them, 20% of them were not used in the training, and then they were evaluated to determine whether they were classified correctly by the model.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Dan.
Hi, Amy. I just had a question that I guess explains my ignorance of the whole techniques. With regard to the hyperspectral work, is there a consistent signature for each plant that can be applied spatially independent, can be regardless of where that plant is growing, or is it context specific? A lot of people are out measuring hyperspectral signatures, and my question is, are we at a point where that can be cross-referenced without having to ground truth it all the time?
That is a really good question, and that's part of what we've been trying to determine. So there are databases out there. USGS has a great database of plant spectral signatures. It includes a few of the species that we encounter. A lot of them are not included, and so that's why we were collecting our own. So we wanted to compare to their database, see how these values compare, but also we've done a little bit of work comparing seasonally, because, plants change over the course of the growing season. And we did find that some species don't change all that much, but some species change dramatically. Reed canary grass being a good example, because, it goes from being pretty green to flowering and having a different kind of inflorescence, and then that goes to seed, and that's a different color. So season is definitely important, and some species are very distinct because of their flowering. So we are hoping to be able to get to the point where we can make some recommendations about when different plants should be flown because of their distinctive or more differentiatable signatures, either because of flowering or their seed heads, or whatever it may be. So it's a work in progress.
So it seems like there's sort of two ways that, and this is what I'm ignorant of, that this can work. One is the distinctness of the signature of the individual plant that you can nail. Mm-hmm. And the ability of the system to distinguish it from other signatures around it, which would vary with the context in which, depending on which estuary, what part of the estuary you're working in. So that's what I'm trying to get a sense for is which of those processes tend to drive your ability to classify communities?
Yeah, well, I think it's both. And again, I think that's why season and timing for flying may be really important, because we did notice, for example, that carex and reed canary grass are pretty similar early in the season. They look pretty similar in May, June timeframe, but later in the season they start to look more different. And so that then would increase the ability to differentiate them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Chanda, you have your hand up.
Sorry, my audio and visual today with Microsoft Teams has just been horrendous. But anyways, really great presentations. I'm really happy and excited to hear about all that's going on and how this technology is being used. I saw that on one of your slides, you mentioned that you were also able to do some SAV monitoring, so submerged aquatic vegetation, with the RGB. And I was wondering, did you also have to do some ground truthing explicit to the submerged vegetation and how accurate those results were? Because I think specifically subtidal areas can be challenging from what I've heard. And so I'm wondering how this technology can be potentially used to and tweaked, I guess, to get better data, remote data for the SAV.
Yeah, another really good question. One near to my heart because I do a lot of work with eelgrass. And well, so first of all, we did do a ground truthing. We collected similar hundreds of samples out there. But it was all at low tide. We went out at a very extreme low tide so that we could get, as much extent as possible. So yeah, this imagery right now, it really doesn't penetrate the water very much. If there's really shallow water, maybe a few inches, we might be able to distinguish something from that. But in general, it's better. It's really designed for where there's no water. We were able to tell, though, the difference between the two species of eelgrass, which was really cool because, they're the same genus, but they differ in size. So their kind of texture is different. And we really wanted to look at the hyperspectral data to know whether their spectral signature is different. I think it probably would be, but we just had too many problems.
Gotcha. Thank you. Really interesting.
Okay, well, I don't see any other hands up right now. So in the interest of time, I'd like to turn to the group discussion. And I'd ask George and Narayan to please turn your cameras on. We'll see how far we can work this Teams technology. I also would like to ask anyone who has a question to please turn your camera on because we're not seeing enough of each other these days. And in fact, anyone else who wants to turn your camera on, please do, because it's nice to see folks. And then if we break the technology, we'll back it off. All right, so who's got a question for any panelist? Come on, guys, otherwise we're gonna have to resort to seed questions, and you know those.
This is Gary, I have a question.
Hi, Gary.
Thanks everybody for the presentations. Those are awesome. I want to talk a little bit, I think, but Narayan mentioned it about developing standard protocols for data collection and analysis and reporting. And more than that, about incorporating this UAS technology as a routine part of the CEERP program and its monitoring effort. So I understand some protocol developments underway. We talk about that, and then maybe Jason or someone could talk more about the programmatic view on protocols for the UASs.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I'll start. So far, it's pretty preliminary. We're just trying to nail down kind of like what Amy was saying with vegetation and seasonality. It varies. So we're trying to nail down what would be the best time of year to fly a site, whether it be pre or post restoration, as part of the photo point metric in the AIMER 3. We're also looking at, yeah, what are you just taking obliques? Are you doing orthomosaics? It just depends on, I guess, the experience the pilot has. So we'd probably start out with something very easy. So just flying at, making something very rigid, maybe like 200 feet altitude above ground level, taking an oblique of whatever restoration action you're looking to track over time. And then we're trying out different apps to use. We use one app that you can recreate the exact same photo, and that would be extremely useful and wouldn't require much experience because it's automated. You just turn the drone on, start your app, look for the picture, which in the metadata has a lat long and altitude, and you can recreate that photo countless times. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I'll let Jason continue with that about programmatics.
Hey guys, want to make sure you can hear me before I keep talking. Okay,
Roger.
so yeah, thanks to everybody for the presentations and for doing it on relatively short notice. Appreciate the time and effort that went into all those presentations. Programmatically, the first thing that comes to my mind, there's a couple thoughts that come to my mind. The first one is, you know, with this technology and the capacity of these tools, and how do we need to add things that go into any of our 3 levels, probably most notably 2 and 3, that go into the protocols that have already been standardized? Seems like we do need to, I think, standardize protocols for collection of data if it's going to feed the AEMR machine, so to speak. And it would be good that, I'm assuming, for that data to be of like collection methods so that it can be comparable. That seems like a no-brainer to me. So the next place I go is it a standalone thing, or is it something we do to when we update all of the protocols, which I know we're in various stages of updating the monitoring protocols right now. So it seems like doing the first thing with just getting a standardized set of protocols for monitoring with drones would be a good first start. I think the other thing rattling around in my brain from this, it's been rattling around before this, is, you know, and like input from ERTG and others, is, you know, how does this stir anything in a different way for the uncertainties work product we'll be discussing later on this afternoon, and capabilities here, or potential capabilities? Does it help to answer or address any uncertainty in a different way than we may have thought it needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jason just said. I think that when we've been talking and having these conversations about leveraging as much information, as much learning as we can from the restoration sites as we move forward. And Greg has been working on, you know, the predictive modeling piece, and any model or leveraging of data is better when you have a standard protocol kind of at the bases, so that you're kind of comparing apples to apples, and especially over time. So when I was hearing the presentation, I was also thinking along the same lines as Gary and Jason about, you know, with our site revisits, is that an ideal time to kind of get this standard kind of collection of where we're at with these sites, along with when they first become established? I think they could definitely help inform some of the results that we put in the synthesis memorandums, those comprehensive results of how effective is the program and what are we doing. And obviously having some kind of standard metrics and reporting would be helpful, because we can kind of collate data across all of our sites. So yeah, I think it's definitely heading in the right direction, and protocol seemed like a good first step.
Okay, thank you guys. Curtis, I apologize, you had your hand up. I'm not sure if you just got tired of waiting. Do you still have a question?
Actually, more of a comment
Right.
about the hyperspectral imaging stuff. Amy brought up that little table, which actually shows some pretty cool results for the RBG information, which is pretty impressive, really. But the beauty of the hyperspectral imagery is that, first of all, once we have the spectral library completed on a seasonal basis, as we were talking about, it means that it will take very little ground truth time to go back to any other site that has the composite of those vegetation types that we have. So the real beauty of using the hyperspectral is that, first of all, we can hone down, the amount of bands we're going to use over time once we have the library set up, which means that the processing power and everything will really be reduced in the future. And as well, the camera we're using is not so great. It's definitely outdated, and there's newer cameras that can be purchased, which are much more automated in this one. So that table that Amy showed is a little bit misleading, I think, about the differences in the two techniques for doing the classifications. So once we have more of these spectral libraries built up, the cameras can be really tweaked and soak in the processing to allow much quicker evaluation of different sites. So I think it's the real promise of the hyperspectral images shouldn't be kind of underwhelmed by the interesting results from the RGB study. So I just want to put that comment out there.
So just following up on that, I guess a question for both you and Amy, since you've both been involved in this project from its inception, this study. Do you, and kind of going back to Narayan's comment on the the need for CERP protocols to be accessible to pilots with varying degrees of experience. What's your gut feeling at this point? Do you think that the hyperspectral is going to be something that could be used program wide?
Well, I mean, I hope so. Of course, there's the cost, so the camera units are not cheap right now. Neither is a LiDAR. But I mean, I think LiDAR is going to be a workhorse for almost all of our survey now, because it's amazingly useful for, not just getting the topography, but for categorization of the sites as well. So as the price of these things comes down, more people have them. Obviously, the utility is going to be much more widespread across different ranges. And that's why we really do need to have like a robust spectral library, open source, that people can add their seasonal variations into to make the categorizations much quicker. And the processing routines like that Andre and our team are working out are getting simplified as well. So the whole idea is that eventually we'll have hopefully a package that can be used regionally and for very rapid assessments of things.
So I'll add a little bit to that, just in what I've been thinking, I guess, over the years, in that I almost think that there are maybe a couple different levels of use, similar to, with AIMER, there's the different levels of monitoring that occur, going from the basic to the more intensive. I think there could be similar levels for using drones, where the very most basic is what Narayan was talking about, with just using them as photo points, which I think is really, really cool because it's just such a great kind of photo point. I mean, you get just a really good sense of the site. But then the maybe next level up from that is using it for more mapping, and hopefully an automated mapping system where you can determine vegetation communities at whatever scale is appropriate, whether it's native and non-natives or to certain species level or something, but that's kind of another level. And I think that many restoration practitioners are getting geared up for doing that. I know certainly Narayan, I think, is getting close to that. I know Sarah has been getting close to that. CLTs collecting, so it's kind of this collecting on an annual basis and being able to look at change. So doing a change analysis. And I'm hoping the methods that we are developing in the processing, our goal is to develop a protocol for the processing that can be utilized to improve this automated mapping, and hopefully it's with RGB or maybe 4-band or something. But then the highest level is using things like LiDAR and hyperspectral to maybe look at things like productivity and biomass production and really, more specific vegetation community change, invasive species, things like that. It's a thought. But I do think there needs to be protocols kind of at each stage for both the collection of the data, heights and all that kind, flight levels, all that kind of stuff, but also the processing.
That's a great thought.
Thanks.
Other questions? Let's open it up to others who are out there. I'm not seeing any hands. I'm assuming Kirk and Dan and Chanda that your hands are from before. Other questions? Okay, I'll ask a general question of all three of you from my list of seed questions. We had to do it. Nobody else is asking. So what is your sense of sort of thinking about the whole stages of restoration, from kind of like initial site identification to planning to implementation to implementation and compliance monitoring to initial monitoring and then long-term monitoring? Where do you think drones have the highest and best applicability?
I'd say all of the above. They're just they're amazing tools. How else can you get such high resolution of your entire site? And like George was saying, you can throw it up in the air at any, like there's limitations with weather and leaf on versus leaf off, but you can do it on the spot at different times of the year. So it's not annual monitoring. It could be, once a month, quarterly. You can really monitor a site, whether it be compliance monitoring or just change over time from pre to post restoration. It's all of the above, I'd say, Haida.
Thank you. I see heads nodding.
Yeah, I'll second that. I mean, that's nice thing about being able to gather this data set at your convenience. You can replicate it. You can target the conditions that you're really interested in. That said, I kind of break off on a little bit of a tangent, but there's some accuracy to be gained from having ground control points, which can be more labor intensive than the actual flight. So I was curious to learn more about these propeller arrow points and whether you thought, how those worked out for you, whether you thought they were a good investment.
I have to admit, I was leery, but they worked great. I was very impressed. Curtis actually purchased them and has them as part of his cadre of tools. So you can talk more about some of the specifics with him. But they were easy to handle. They were easy to deploy. They collected good data. They were very visible in all of the imagery. I thought they were great.
Yeah, I'd say they're an improvement to my spray paint. The reason I use spray paint is so I don't have to go back and pick it up.
Well, yeah, that is an advantage. They float. These do float though. So and we did get caught by the tide, and
Oh,
they floated, and we were able to recover it, and it was still functional. So that was good.
Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left in this hour, so I think I'm going to just thank the three of you so much on behalf of all the participants. I know it's challenging giving online talks, and there's so many of them these days. We really, really appreciate it. This is a conversation that's maybe a bit overdue, and it's just great to have it started up. And I think we all just really appreciated your different perspectives and experience. So thank you. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Gary, the lead facilitator for the ERTG. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Hayden.
Hey, Gary, can I ask one more question or just plant a seed?
Sorry.
Sure.
So just following up on, the question around protocols, start just thinking about what would be the best way to get everybody together virtually. I'm assuming to have that conversation, and those things don't just happen magically. And want to think about the best way to facilitate that, if it needs to be coming from an ERTG meeting, a science work group meeting, a separate workshop. Those are just a few things off the top of my head, but I'd like to follow up on it with folks who are interested. Thanks.
Yeah, roger that. Well, I second the thanks to everybody. This was really great 2 hours. Appreciate it very, very much. So with that, I will click off the recording and